I'm John Sipher.
And I'm Jerry O'Shea.
Between us, we have over 60 years of experience as clandestine officers in the CIA, serving in high-risk areas all around the world.
Part of our job was creating conspiracies, like being undercover, to deceive our adversaries.
Now, we're going to use that experience to investigate the conspiracy theories everyone's talking about, as well as some you may not have heard.
Could these be true, or are we being manipulated?
Find out now on Mission Implausible. So our guest today is Liz Oyer. Liz served as a pardon attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. That office sits at the center of the federal clemency system where pardon and commutation requests happen. And they can involve politics, public pressure, and sometimes a lot of misinformation. Earlier in her career, she worked in private practice and also spent more than a decade as a federal public defender, representing indigent clients in federal court. She studied at Georgetown and Harvard Law, but after being fired by Pam Bondi, she has spoken out, sharing thoughts on the state of our democracy. She's here to help us separate how the clemency process actually operates from the narratives that often grow up around it. So welcome, Liz. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I really appreciate how you're engaging publicly after a career inside. You're doing so in both an entertaining and effective way, and you're seeking to educate the public. But, as a former federal official who was proud of his work and loved it, I know how hard it must be to be inside now, trying to figure out how to navigate what to do and what to do if you leave. So what would you say to career DOJ staff who fear retaliation if they speak openly? Or what do you tell young people looking at federal service? Where are the ethical red lines now, and how should people operate in this new politicized environment?
That's a very timely question because it is a very difficult time to be a civil servant, to be working in government. Demands are being put on career Justice Department officials that sometimes require them to choose between maintaining their ethical duties that they have as lawyers and pleasing their bosses. And that's a very challenging situation to be in. I would say to all who are working inside the Justice Department and really inside federal service writ large that once you compromise your integrity, you cannot get it back. So you have to understand where your own personal lines are. And at some point, you have to be willing to walk away if you're being asked to do something that will sacrifice your own personal integrity. But I do think there's value to trying to stay and trying to be a force for good inside the government right now, especially if you're able to do that without compromising your own ethics and integrity. And there are quite a lot of folks within the Justice Department and beyond who continue to try to do that every day, even though the circumstances are difficult. And I really respect and admire what those folks are doing.
Yeah, we read about them resigning or being fired every week, right? So there's a sort of fewer and fewer of them. So on sacrifice, Liz, so you got fired, and by any honest account, this happened as a result of, and there's no way around it, a government conspiracy, right? I believe, Charlie, you are the victim of a conspiracy, not a conspiracy theory. And I'd like to explore that a little bit with you. So to kick it off, let me ask you first two quick things. Talk us through real quick in the audience about the power any president has, right, to either pardon or commute, crimes. And then let's see how that plays out with your brush with Hollywood actor Mel Gibson, right? And here it's unfortunate. This is how you came to prominence. There was corruption, politics, weapons, domestic violence against women. And this sounds like the themes from Braveheart, but here they come together against you and put you up against, an element of Hollywood and what can really only be described as a conspiracy because you did stand up for what you thought. So could you maybe take us through those two things?
Yeah, so the pardon power is one of the least understood parts of our Constitution because it's so kind of out of sync with the rest of it, which creates this separation of powers system of checks and balances. But the pardon power is sort of an outlier because it gives an absolute power to the president to grant pardons and commutations, which are reductions of sentence, to anybody he chooses for any reason without the ability of any other branch of government to intervene to stop him. So it's a very very broad power that the president possesses. Historically, the power has always been anchored by this idea that most every president has believed, that it should be used in the public interest, that it should be used for the public good, not for private financial or political gain. There have been undoubtedly examples of misuse of the pardon power by many presidents throughout history. There was the pardon of Mark Rich by Bill Clinton, who was a major political donor, who was also a fugitive from justice at the time. So that was a pretty extraordinary pardon. There was Joe Biden's pardon of his son Hunter, which I've been critical of. So there have been these examples, but those are the outliers. And for the most part, most presidents have tried to use the pardon power in most cases in a way that enhances our system of justice, that makes it fairer, that gives second chances to people who've really earned and deserved them. But that all came to a screeching halt when Donald Trump came back into office, and he, on day one in office, pardoned all of the January 6 rioters. He issued a blanket pardon to about 1,500 people who were involved in the Capitol insurrection, and with one signature, wiped out effectively 4 years of work to hold those people accountable for the crimes that they committed. And it has continued like that, with a lot of pardons being granted. Really, almost all the pardons that he's granted have been to serve some political or personal or financial interest of the president without consideration of what's in the public interest. And that's where Mel Gibson comes into this story. So
Yeah, go ahead. I liked
tell us
Mad Max and I liked Braveheart, but I don't like much else about Mel Gibson. But go on, please take us through this.
So Mel Gibson was made an ambassador to Hollywood by Donald Trump. And you both probably know that that's not a real ambassadorship. But nevertheless, Donald Trump gave him that title. I guess he's a fan of Braveheart or maybe Lethal Weapon. Uh, and after Trump was inaugurated, Mel Gibson's lawyers sent a letter to the Justice Department asking the Attorney General to reinstate Mel Gibson's right to own a gun. He lost his right to own a gun because he was convicted of a very serious domestic violence crime involving the mother of one of his children, his ex. And if you commit a domestic violence crime in this country, that prohibits you under federal law from owning a gun because it is dangerous for people who have domestic violence histories to be armed. It makes it much more likely that those types of incidents will result in serious injury or even death. So Mel Gibson tried to buy a gun, according to his lawyer, in 2023, and he was denied because of his criminal history. And he wrote a letter to the Attorney General essentially saying, my client has made all these famous movies. He's a friend of Donald Trump. You have the statutory authority to give him his gun rights back, so please do. And then I was asked to write a memo to the Attorney General recommending that she do this, recommending that she give Mel Gibson his gun rights back. And I wasn't willing to do it. I went back and forth with a political appointee in the administration about this quite a few times. I think I made it clear that my position was not flexible on this issue, particularly because we didn't do any of the normal investigation that you would expect to do before you make this type of decision.
Right.
So I didn't really know anything about Mel Gibson other than what his lawyer had said and what I had read in the media and, what I'd seen in his movies.
He'd knocked his girlfriend's teeth out, right? And he had threatened to kill her and was threatening a police officer with anti-Semitic remarks. I mean, this is
that's
quite serious.
What's been reported. It's very serious stuff. Yeah, very serious stuff. And none of the hallmarks of like this is a person who should safely be able to be armed. There's nothing about his background that says this is somebody who we trust can responsibly own a firearm. I certainly didn't have enough information to be persuaded of that. So I declined to make that recommendation. I declined the invitation to change my mind about making that recommendation. And within a few hours of my sort of final refusal, I was fired from my post at the Justice Department. I was actually in a meeting with about 25 officials from different DOJ offices, including some of the political appointees who had been asking me to make this recommendation. And a colleague came into the room and literally pulled me out by the elbow, told me to grab my stuff, and told me in the hallway outside this meeting that there were security officers back in my office waiting to watch me pack up my things and escort me out of the building.
I just want to jump in one more time before John. So they wanted you to make the recommendation. So if Mel Gibson killed somebody afterwards, they would blame you, right? Rather than the person who did it.
Yeah, couldn't they have, that's a question, couldn't they have just said, okay, Liz, thanks, we'll do it ourselves, or
Yeah.
somebody else can do it, or like, why did they
Yeah,
make
yeah, exactly. I mean, the irony of it is that Pam Bondi did it anyway after I was fired. She went ahead and did it, and she didn't need my recommendation to do it because she has the authority to do it without my recommendation. But they wanted me to recommend it so that it would look like it was legitimate, so that it would look like it was not just a political favor for a friend of the president. It would look like it was actually based in the sound judgment and expertise of a career professional, not a political appointee. And that's been sort of a pattern throughout the conduct of this Justice Department. They're trying to put career officials in a position where they provide a veneer of legitimacy to decisions that are actually purely political in nature. And that has what has resulted in a lot of folks deciding that they can no longer work there.
Yeah, it makes you complicit. So you talked about there wasn't the regular investigation behind this effort to pardon Mel Gibson. So tell me a little bit about that. Like, what do you know? What does a pardon attorney do? Like, what does that office look like? What do they do? What kind of investigations going? Like, sort of give us a little sense of that job.
Yeah, it is actually really hard to get a pardon. I mean, I would analogize it to like getting nominated for the Supreme Court or something. It is very, very difficult. There are people around the country who are seeking pardons, sort of coming from two different places. One is people who are incarcerated who are seeking commutations of their sentence, so a reduction of a sentence of imprisonment. And many of those folks are people who were sentenced under mandatory minimum laws and are serving extremely long sentences, in some cases life sentences for drug offenses, and they're really seeking an opportunity to have a second chance at life in the community by seeking a commutation. The other type of application that we got was applications for pardons, which is essentially forgiveness from the president. And that form of relief is typically reserved for people who are in the community and have paid their debts to society. They've served their entire prison sentence. They've paid back any fines or restitution they might owe to any victims, and they have done really extraordinary things and demonstrated that they are worthy of forgiveness. People who have criminal convictions sometimes suffer with collateral consequences of those convictions for their entire life, and they can affect people really negatively even after they have turned their life around completely and tried to move forward in another direction. One complaint that we heard a lot in these applications is parents and grandparents would say, I can't go on a school field trip with my child or my grandchild because my criminal conviction prohibits it. Or people had very difficult time getting professional licensing. There are certain professions that will exclude you from licensing if you have a criminal conviction, like being a real estate agent or working in a beauty salon. Lots of different things that can really impact. So we would get applications from folks around the country who were asking for the mercy of the president, and we very carefully vetted all of those applications, which included reviewing a great deal of information about the applicant's history. And in cases of those seeking a pardon, we actually would then refer the application to the FBI before we'd make a recommendation, and they would do a full background investigation, which involved going out in the community and interviewing the applicant, interviewing their neighbors, their employer, their family members, because we really wanted to be sure that before we recommend that the president grant someone this extraordinary form of relief, that they are deserving and they're going to use it wisely and they're not going to go back out there and commit more crimes. So it's a really intensive vetting process that I would analogize to like getting a security clearance, essentially.
What percentage of people who ask for commutations or pardons get it? Like, so when you get these things and you go through them, how many do you approve or send up the chain?
It's an extremely small number. It's far less than 10%. I would say that we would recommend favorably, and a small fraction of the ones recommended that actually get over the finish line and are granted by the president.
So I just want to be clear, though. A pardon is not an exoneration. You're still guilty, right? It's just that your rights may be restored, or you can say you were pardoned. Is that right?
That's right. Yep, that's exactly right. It's forgiveness. And generally accepting responsibility for your crime is typically a prerequisite to getting a pardon. Not in
But
the current administration, but
no,
has
no,
been
no, no, no.
historically.
That's the conspiracy. But a commutation, and this impacts on, I think people need to be aware of this, or at least I need to understand this better. It means you don't have to pay back the restitution. So if I were to steal, if I were to embezzle $1 million and then I get sent to jail for this, and I take $1 million and donate it to, certain presidential campaign, and I get a commutation, I don't have to pay the money back anymore, right? There's either the taxpayer or the victims they're just like shit out of luck. Is that correct, or how does that work?
Well, historically, that has not been the case. Historically,
Historically.
commutation, historically, commutations have generally affected only the imprisonment portion of a sentence. So you might get your sentence reduced and get out of jail early, but you'd still be expected to pay back any fines or restitution you owed. Donald Trump has done commutations differently. He has started using commutations not only to reduce prison sentences, but also to wipe out financial penalties that accompany crime, including very large sums of restitution owed to victims of crime, people who've been defrauded and lost money, that sort of thing.
Jeez. So just to step back again, you worked in the Department of Justice under the Trump administration, not for very long, but for a little while, and you've obviously are in touch with that world. What can you tell us about Pam Bondi's Department of Justice and how it differs from previous administrations?
Well, what has changed fundamentally is that the Department of Justice is taking instructions from the White House and then sort of pushing down directives to the workforce rather than the experts in the Justice Department advising the Attorney General and then the Attorney General advising the president about what types of decisions to make. So typically, the way it would work is the Attorney General would be the expert who's telling the president, here's what we're doing. And instead, it's been completely reversed. The decision making seems to be occurring within the White House. Decisions are fully baked before they even reach the Attorney General, and then she is tasked with just pushing down those decisions to the workforce. It was clear on day one of her tenure that that was how it was going to be when she issued a flurry of memos to the career workforce of the Justice Department. I was still there at that time. And the most chilling memo she sent was one that said, essentially, you are all the president's lawyers. You are expected to implement the president's directives. I had never thought of myself as a Department of Justice lawyer as a lawyer for the president. That was true under Trump and it was true under Biden. I believed that my role was to serve the American people, to serve my fellow citizens in that role. And it had never dawned on me that my job was to serve the president, the person, the man. But that was how Pam Bondi viewed it. And she made that very clear to the workforce. And she has subsequently made statements to the effect that anybody who cannot get on board with that will be rooted out and fired.
A lot of Americans would think, hey, that makes sense. He's the president. He should decide these things. What could if people have that view, what would you tell Americans of why maybe that's dangerous? Those of us who were in government sort of understand,
Yeah,
we took an oath to the Constitution and all that
that's
type
exactly
of stuff.
right. John and I, we took an oath to the Constitution, never to any president.
But a lot of Americans probably think, well, we elected him. He's in charge. He should do this. Can you explain why that's not necessarily the best way for things to work?
Yeah, so the Justice Department has been intentionally sort of distanced from the White House ever since Watergate, really, because the idea is that it's not good for decisions about law enforcement and prosecution to be made based on politics. The Justice Department is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. It employs about 110,000 people. And most of these people, the overwhelming majority, are career experts experts who are expected to follow facts and law to where those facts and law lead them, not to initiate prosecutions because they're politically beneficial or because someone in politics doesn't like a particular person. The Justice Department has really important non-political responsibilities, which include protecting public safety, protecting our national security proactively against threats from foreign powers, and upholding the civil rights of all Americans. Those are not political functions, and having them treated as political functions is actually very dangerous to all Americans. So that's the reason that the Justice Department has been has tried to maintain this degree of non-political independence, and having the president interfere with the functions of the Justice Department to achieve political ends really puts all Americans in danger. And it also gives the president just a tremendous amount of power that is intended to be power reserved to all of us, the citizens, but to concentrate that in one person is quite scary.
Yeah, and not that I would believe this has anything to do with corruption or conspiracy, but I do note that Pam Bondi's brother Brad has been on a winning streak since she came in. As far as the court cases, he's been winning, and what the Justice Department decisions have been. But I'm I feel better knowing that there's an DOJ ethics director and a professional responsibility director and an inspector general, or isn't there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm going to answer that, but let me start by telling a funny story about Brad Bondi. Pam Bondi's brother, Brad, is a lawyer here in DC, where I live. He practices in New York as well. And he actually sent me a cease and desist letter a little while back because I posted something on my social media highlighting the fact that a client of Brad Bondi's had gotten a pardon from Donald Trump very early in the second term. And the pardon actually wiped out about $600 million in restitution that this person, Trevor Milton, Bondi's client, owed to a bunch of different investors that he had defrauded. I pointed out that association, and Brad Bondi's lawyers actually sent me a cease and desist letter, and they cited a news article in which Trevor Milton, Bondi's client, had said, "Oh yeah, Brad Bondi had nothing to do with getting me this pardon, but he's awesome." So he is trying very hard to cultivate this idea that his success in the law has nothing to do with the fact that his sister is now the attorney general, but his track record.
Yeah.
His track record is pretty staggering. I don't know any lawyer who has a track record like Brad Bondi in litigating against the Justice Department. He has had at least 2 different cases that we know of dismissed outright. Cases that the Justice Department was actively prosecuting just have been dismissed under the leadership of Pam Bondi, which is something that almost never happens in federal court. And it's particularly striking that one of these cases involved a COVID-19 fraud. So a woman who who got fraudulent government benefits under the COVID relief program. And this is something that supposedly DOJ is very aggressively prosecuting right now. So, it's smart. If you can get Brad Bondi on your case, it's a smart move to try to get out from under those charges. And what's happening here is something that typically the Justice Department would have all sorts of safeguards in place to address. There are rules about conflict of interest and recusal, which means having to kind of remove yourself from a case so that you're not granting any special treatment to people based on personal relationships or other types of connections. But Pam Bondi has systematically removed all of those safeguards from the Justice Department. She has fired people who are career experts behind the scenes who you probably never heard of, but they play really important roles in maintaining the day-to-day integrity of the Justice Department. And that includes the career official who is her ethics director, the person who is tasked with enforcing those federal ethics rules. It also includes the head of the Office of Professional Responsibility, so the person who would adjudicate complaints about misconduct by DOJ officials. And DOJ has lost its inspector general, who's sort sort of this independent presence who has the authority to conduct investigations into misconduct within the department and even to recommend sanctions for that type of conduct. So really, there is nobody left to police the corruption. And, Brad Bondi is crying that he is not getting any special treatment. But the way it looks to the public is very troubling, and it really diminishes the credibility of the whole institution.
Yeah, what a coincidence. And it doesn't sound like a conspiracy to me at all.
Maybe you guys could create a shadow DOJ now with all the people who've been fired and put out to the public how this all should work with each one of these cases.
Well, that's actually what I've really been trying to do as sort of a continuation of my public service, is to keep tabs on what's going on there and call out what is not normal. And, there's a lot of legal commentary right now about what's happening in the Justice Department, but there aren't so many people who are really just trying to make everyday Americans who aren't immersed in the weeds of the DOJ understand how unusual and scary and dangerous all of this is. And that's what I've been trying to do, just focusing on little pieces of information that are really, really troubling and that are easy to lose track of with all the news cycle, and trying to make folks understand why they're so alarming and dangerous and why we really need to be seeking accountability from the leaders of the Justice Department right now.
That's why, experts often speak in sort of this expertise, academic speak, and it doesn't translate to normal people. So trying to just explain the processes of our government to our citizens, I think, is a really important thing. And I think you do that very well. But let me ask you this. Obviously, they're not happy with you speaking publicly about these things. It makes them look bad. And have you received threats or efforts at retribution from the administration? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so there has been a series of things that have happened, some of which I've spoken publicly about and some of which I haven't. But the most chilling part was when I had decided to speak up about my firing. I was very outspoken about it from really right after it happened, because I just have this strong sense, I think, of injustice. And this was an injustice to me. And it's dangerous to fire people because they, use their expertise in the way that they're intended to. So I spoke up about it. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, who signed the one-page memo firing me, said that I was lying. And he didn't say, what I was lying about or provide any evidence that I was lying, but he said that I was lying. And then I was asked by members of Congress to testify at a spotlight hearing, they called it, about the Justice Department. I was scheduled to testify on a Monday, and the Friday night before my scheduled testimony, I was out with my parents and my husband, and we were in the car driving home from the Kennedy Center, which is the last time I've been to the Kennedy Center, last March. And I got a call on my cell phone around 9:15 in the evening from a Justice Department phone number, which I thought was unusual because they'd fired me a month earlier. And it was a very kind, dedicated civil servant who was not supposed to be calling me, but was giving me a heads up that he had learned that there were 2 armed special deputy U.S. Marshals on their way to my home to deliver me a letter, and that the letter was a warning about the risks of testifying before Congress and the legal peril that I could put myself into if I went forward with my testimony. And I absolutely panicked, in part because my child, who's a teenager, but still my baby, was at home alone, and these men were expected to arrive at my house at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday. And I just knew that my child would be absolutely terrified if these armed men showed up at the door and nobody else was home. So this person who called was able to help me get those men called off so that they did not show up at my doorstep that night. And I am incredibly grateful for that. I did end up then receiving the letter, which was sent to me by email. I don't know why it couldn't have just been sent to me by email in the first place. And I then decided, after I read the letter, that I needed to find a lawyer, because it seemed like the Justice Department planned on pursuing a course of retaliation against me. And that was another terrible experience. It was sort of right at the height of this time when the administration was trying to intimidate the defense bar, law firms, by using these executive orders. And I spent an entire weekend, my husband and I, calling all the lawyers we know, which is a lot. I mean, we've both been lawyers in Washington, D.C. for over 20 years, and nobody wanted to represent me. Nobody wanted to send a letter to Todd Blanche saying, right back at you. Or nobody wanted to sit behind me at a congressional hearing because everybody was running scared from the administration at that point. So it was really just a terrible time. And honestly, I've been just so disappointed in my fellow lawyers. There are lots of lawyers who are doing great stuff right now, but the legal profession as a whole has not risen to the occasion. And it's in large part because these law firms just capitulated and folded so early and really set a precedent for cowardice.
A lot of professions, actually. But
Yeah. Yep.
So I want to go down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole that I fear isn't a conspiracy theory. Is that so? Famously, Justice Sotomayor asked at the case not too long ago about the how much immunity a president has, right, for making decisions and for making, if it's an executive order. And the question, of course, the famous question was, well, if the president, Donald Trump, or whoever, whichever future president, orders his political rival to be killed by a SEAL team, would that be covered? And the answer was yes. The president would be covered, but the SEAL team members who committed the murder would not. Except the president, you're the pardon lawyer, the president could pardon everyone involved in the murder of his political appointee, and you thus have like this self-licking ice cream cone where you have legal judicial murder. Now, is this, it's a theory, but is this a bridge too far? Or at least theoretically, is such a thing possible as we're sliding into, I think, possibly into authoritarianism?
It's pretty shocking to even have to think about that scenario.
It
but that
is.
is a
It
scenario that is no longer outlandish or unrealistic thanks to the Supreme Court and thanks to the fact that we have a president who seems untethered from any norms around the public interest. So yes, I think that is possible. Another example that Justice Sotomayor raised is, could the president sell pardons? And it seems like he actually is selling pardons. People are getting pardons based on large financial donations to the president's personal or political or business interests. So we've gone fully down the path of corrupting the functions of government to the point that the president feels emboldened to use official power for personal financial gain, which no other president has really been comfortable doing so transparently.
We worked in CIA, which is a foreign intelligence organization. It's not meant to have arrest or domestic powers whatsoever. And I wrote a piece with a former agency lawyer, Jim Petrilla, for the Washington Post at one point, talking about the Supreme Court immunity ruling, which would allow him to use these kind of very powerful organizations for almost personal purposes and get away with it if you follow this along. And Jerry and I understand that, the American people, I think, benefit by a well-regulated, serious intelligence service, which answers to Congress and has, into the DOJ. But given what the Supreme Court said, I think, you could see, and it happened in the past, in the 50s and other things, you could use these powerful organizations, FBI and CIA and others, against the interests of American citizens. And so, I don't know if Americans have sort of picked up on this thing and how dangerous it is potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we've seen that to some extent with the use the use of the National Guard. Donald Trump has been sending out the National Guard to perform functions that they've never been asked to perform before, and he's really just sort of flexing by doing this. I mean, here in Washington, D.C., we have National Guard walking around the city picking up trash. If you go to the train station, which I've done a few times since they arrived, they're just standing around, hanging out.
Yeah.
It's not clear why they're here, but Donald Trump wants to sort of make a show of authority by having the National Guard stationed around the city. And a lot of what he's doing is performative, and a lot of what he is doing is really motivated, I think, by enriching himself and his family and strengthening his own hold on America.
Well, or in our world, I mean, sending Tulsi Gabbard to Georgia to go into to look at domestic voting issues. There's no, in our statutes, there's nothing that would allow a foreign intelligence official to get involved in domestic things like that. I think it's incredibly dangerous, and sort of it just was on the news for a day or two, and that's the end of that.
Yeah, it's just such an unserious approach to governance. And I think Donald Trump has realized that if you just act without really worrying about, is this lawful or is this okay? It's going to be too late probably to undo it by the time it gets up through the courts. The damage is done, the effect is accomplished. And so he's just moving forward with doing what he wants without waiting for the type of advice that other presidents would seek to determine in advance if the conduct is lawful. He's just going for it. And then, maybe a few years from now, the Supreme Court will weigh in on some of these issues. And even if they decide them against him, the damage is already done.
I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about how broad the pardon power is. So just looking back, I did a little bit of research that the first pardons was 1794, right? It was the Whiskey Rebellion. But it turns out, there was a rebellion against the U.S. because people wanted to brew whiskey and didn't want to pay taxes on it. But that really only impacted on 2 people. And then there was Andrew Johnson after the Civil War ended, where he did issue a pardon to Confederate insurrectionists, but they had to re-swear an oath to the United States. So it wasn't just here you go. But to what level, could Donald Trump go out and basically pardon 25,000 people, anybody who was involved in whatever whatever criminality he decides he wants to become involved in? Where is sort of the constitutionally it's almost unbridled, but are there any guardrails or sort of dimensions within which that can't fit?
There's really only 2 limitations. One is that the president cannot pardon crimes under state law, so only federal crimes can be pardoned. However, Donald Trump has tried to push that limit. He did grant a pardon to about 70, I think it was 77 people who were involved in efforts to overthrow the 2020 election. And those were people who are being prosecuted under state laws. And so the pardons don't have any legal effect. But he nevertheless, he issued this broad pardon proclamation. The other limitation is that you can't pardon future crimes. So on his way out the door, Donald Trump could pardon everybody in his administration for every federal crime they may have committed up until the last day of his presidency. He can't pardon them for conduct that occurs after that, but he could, and I think very likely will, grant very broad pardons to those in his administration who have done his bidding, his henchmen, essentially. And it would not surprise me in the least if he already has some of those pardons stashed away in a desk drawer with his signature on it, just in case something happens to him before he leaves office. Because there are some people in there, like the Stephen Millers of the world, who are probably going to need those pardons. And Donald Trump may have already written them out. This issue came up in the context of some of the.
If I can interrupt you.
Yeah.
Written them out, meaning he's already done it? Because let's just, God, heaven forfend again, he drops over tomorrow, right? And up to wherever he is. Those people, they're out of luck, right? Unless he's already given the pardon, if he were to drop dead.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Well, if he were to die before he leaves office, he couldn't sign any more pardons. I suppose his successor could come in and sign pardons, but I think that there is a likelihood that he's already signed pardons for members of his family and those who are truly in his inner circle politically, right, just in case something should happen to him. I don't know that for a fact, and maybe that's a conspiracy theory in itself, but I think that's possible. The other context in which this has troublingly arisen is the conduct of ICE officers. We saw 2 very high-profile incidents in which ICE agents killed American citizens, and then we saw Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance go on television and say, these agents have absolute immunity. That's not true legally, the absolute immunity idea, but it could refer to the fact that the president has the authority to pardon these people for any federal civil rights crimes they could potentially be charged with. So one possibility is that Trump will broadly pardon ICE agents on his way out the door. That would not be surprising either. It would be shocking, but it wouldn't come as a surprise at this point.
Okay. Well,
yeah, so a pardon could apply broadly to any crimes. We actually saw that in the pardons of the Biden family members that unfortunately were signed at the end of the Biden administration. The president broadly pardoned his son for any crimes up to the date of the signing of the pardon, and then he pardoned his siblings and their spouses for any nonviolent crimes that they may have committed. Essentially, I believe it covered a 10-year period, and it didn't specify what crimes. It just said any crimes, which would mean any crimes under federal law.
Liz, you've been really generous with your time, so we won't keep you too much longer, but we have a couple short questions. One is, if we're talking about what Trump might do, I can imagine some listeners that don't pay attention to these things saying, "Oh, you guys are sort of catastrophizing." But it seems like there's been some patterns here. So when you were explaining earlier how the process normally works, it sounded to me like you're suggesting that a lot of this stuff comes from the bottom up. So there stuff is coming into the Justice Department. You're looking at things and you're suggesting them as possible. The ones that pass your 10% or whatever up to the administration. But it sounds to me, if we're looking for patterns of perhaps poor behavior, is that the pardons we're seeing now are coming top down. They're like somebody calling President Trump on the phone or a buddy reaching into the White House,
Mel Gibson,
and then him telling the Justice Department to do it. Is that a normal thing? Has that happened a lot, or is that something that's happening much more now than happened in the past?
It has become the new normal, but it was absolutely not normal in the past for, hundreds of years. But what's happening now is pardons are being dispensed very casually on the basis of personal or financial relationships. We saw one incident where a woman who's a Trump donor who lives in Palm Beach, Florida, paid $1 million to attend a dinner at Mar-a-Lago with the president. And about a week later, he signed a full pardon for her son, who had not served any of his prison sentence. We saw another incident in which Trey Gowdy, the former congressman, went golfing with the president, mentioned a client of his who needed a pardon, and days later, Donald Trump gave him a full pardon, even though that person was actually being prosecuted at that moment by Trump's own DOJ. So these sort of quid pro quos are really pretty transparent right now, and that is quite unusual.
So I was wondering if you could comment on drugs. So on the one hand, we are bombing boats off the coast of Venezuela, which purportedly are ferrying drugs or could be ferrying drugs, or we have intelligence that intimates they might, because we're having a war on this, supposedly. But at the same time, we've got people like Ross Ulbricht, who was convicted of on the dark web of enabling $200 million worth of drugs to be sold. And he was soliciting murder for hire. And then you've got Hernandez, the former president of Venezuela, who responsible for 400 tons of cocaine coming into the United States. He too was pardoned for reasons that escape me. So when there's, and I'll use the word conspiracy, but people are conspiring. They're sitting in a room someplace, I guess, in DOJ or the White House, and saying, who are we going to pardon and why? And so, how are they making these decisions? And what is it about drugs that, like, on the one hand, they're fine with some of the biggest drug pushers in the United States, being set free. And on the other hand, killing two guys, floating in some wreckage someplace. I don't know. Can you explain this conundrum to me, or at least how you understand it?
There is no way to reconcile it. It makes absolutely no sense. And looking for a logical explanation is a lost cause. The former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was serving a 45-year prison sentence. This was the result of an investigation and prosecution that had taken more than a decade to build. And Donald Trump just unraveled the whole thing with a pardon for no apparent reason. It's just absolutely stunning. It cannot be reconciled with any common sense or logic. He seems to be operating purely based on whim. There's always something in it for Donald Trump, I think we've learned, and I don't know what specifically that was in this case, but he clearly saw something that, he identified with in this corrupt elected foreign leader who turned his country into a narco state and then ended up being held accountable with a very lengthy prison sentence.
So we'll get you out of here with this one. Can he pardon himself?
That's a legal question that nobody really knows the definitive answer to. The Justice Department issued an opinion back in the time of the Nixon scandal that said that the president cannot pardon himself. But the decision, the recommendation or the opinion of the Justice Department is not necessarily binding. If the Supreme Court were actually to take up the issue, they would have the final say on that. But there's a theory that, you can't be the judge in your own case, therefore you can't pardon yourself. However, there's no specific limitation in the Constitution that says the president can't pardon himself. So we don't know that for sure.
Well, listen, Liz, thank you so much. We're really big fans. We really appreciate it. For people who haven't followed Liz before, how can they find you, and what are you working on, now and moving forward?
Yeah, I'm on all the social media channels as well as Substack as Lawyer Oyer. You can see my whole website at lawyeroyer.com. And then I'm Lawyer Oyer on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, even.
Blue Sky?
Yes, I'm on Blue Sky and X. And I'm working on building out my media work to try to do more educational content about threats to the rule of law in the form of a nonprofit organization. And I'm hoping to have that launched very soon so that I can partner with some other legal experts to bring my fellow citizens more information about things that they should be keeping tabs on.
Great. Well,
Can
thank
I
you
ask
so much.
you guys one
Yeah, well,
question
actually, yeah,
about
go ahead.
in the pardon space?
You can ask more
Go
than one.
for
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
So have you heard about this guy, John Kiriakou?
Jesus. Okay, here goes.
Kiriakou.
He's a
I think it's
convicted
pronounced.
felon, by the way.
Kiriakou.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
So there's an article that just came out in Vanity Fair that talks about this case. This former CIA agent, John Kiriakou, who was seeking a pardon during Trump's first presidency. And the article describes this unbelievable encounter in which he goes to the Trump Hotel and meets with Rudy Giuliani, who had come with his chief of staff. And he says, hey, I want to talk to you about a pardon. I heard you're the guy to see about pardons. And Giuliani was during Trump's first administration. And Giuliani got up and went to the bathroom. And then his chief of staff said, no, you're not supposed to talk to Rudy about the pardons. You're supposed to talk to me about the pardons. And then I talked to Rudy about the pardons. And anyway, he then proceeds to quote the guy a price. He says, $2 million for a pardon. And you probably know more about Kiriakou than I do, but apparently he had lost his $700,000 government pension as a result of a criminal conviction. And it sounds like, he didn't have $2 million. And he also apparently told the guy, why would I spend $2 million to try to recover my $700,000 pension? See you later. And he didn't get the pardon. But that is where this whole sort of quid pro quo in the pardon system began during Trump's first presidency. And, as former CIA agents, I'm just curious to know if you think does that case have any merit? Is he somebody who deserves a pardon?
You go first, Jerry.
He doesn't. He's guilty. Yeah, I mean, he's guilty of a number of things. And I'll just say, I may need to work through this. I see him occasionally on speaking in TikTok and things like that. And a lot of what he's saying just isn't true. I mean, just completely untrue. He's making it up. So I don't understand if he's delusional or whether he believes it. But he was found guilty, and he was guilty. John, your thoughts? I don't have any reason to doubt it.
Yeah, and he spent a long time sort of lying about. He done stuff for RT, the Russians. I see him on these videos on social media talking about how, when he was in Pakistan, his chief told him to go kill someone who was following him, and then he's making just like outrageous, very easy to follow lies. I mean, he worked in the agency from like the mid '90s to the early 2000s or something. And he says, well, I've been used on Hollywood movies. I was someone who was very important in giving advice to like True Lies. Like True Lies came out like 1993. There's no chance that he was involved. But so I think he's become a very delusional person, and he was in fact guilty of what he was charged with. And so, yeah, but I can also see he's also not in the hoi polloi with enough money to play the game that sounds like Rudy Giuliani and these other people were.
And it's not illegal to lie now. So, I think he's out there spreading untruths. My not my opinion. That's clear to me that is the case. Yeah, we have some bad apples too.
Yeah, I think he's still hoping he has a shot at a pardon.
He might. Liz, it is genuinely a real honor to have you. I think you are brave and intrepid and one of the best examples of what some people call the deep state and the rest of us call dedicated professionals, right?
Thank you so much.
It's really pleased that we're really pleased and privileged to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.